Okay, so let's look at the last segment here of civil rights. It is very important for us to realize that the civil rights movement went beyond black and white. This is certainly an opportunity for other racial minorities in the United States to push for their own equal status. And in many ways, we saw the collaboration of some of these groups together in order to fight for rights. So the first minority I wanted to highlight is Mexican Americans. There is a long-standing pattern of Mexican Americans kind of gaining a little bit more recognition, or at the very least, being able to enter into the United States with less obstruction when there's a high demand for labor. So, we did see that during World War II, there was pretty significant migration into the U.S. in order to meet that labor demand during the war. Some Mexican Americans, in fact, many of them, entered the U.S. in what was called the Bracero program, or Bracero. I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. But what this was sort of a temporary work program where Mexican Americans could enter for a work purpose, but the idea was that they were not meant to stay there permanently. Many of them returned to Mexico after the war was over. The Bracero program was also one in which the workers tended to be treated very harshly. Their work was not particularly rewarded. So the experience through the Bracero program energized a lot of Mexican Americans to try to organize and try to fight for their own rights. So one effort that they take is they form an organization called the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC. What this league does is it emphasizes assimilation into American society, and it increased political participation through voting. So you're going to see that just like African Americans, some Mexican Americans were also segregated in society. And so by organizing this league, they do win some key battles to end segregation, including some Supreme Court decisions. But there is going to be a pushback against this Mexican American effort. In the 1950s, Operation Wetback commences, and this was an effort by the government to round up undocumented immigrants and deport them back to Mexico. And so this shows us, again, that there's a clear denial of basic civil rights for Mexican Americans. And also it demonstrates a pretty widespread distrust of Anglo-Americans among the Mexican American community and the Latin American community at large. So you do experience, to a certain extent, you could see a connection between this and maybe some of the more militant activists of the Black civil rights movement, in the sense that this pushback sort of fuels more antagonism towards minorities and the white mainstream. Puerto Ricans are in one of the most interesting positions as minorities in the United States. Bringing us way, way back to the Spanish-American War for a moment. You may remember that the U.S. defeated Spain in 1898, and one of the concessions that they got from Spain was the island of Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is interesting because the people that live in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens, right? But Puerto Rico is not a state. And citizens can vote in primary elections. They pay taxes, but they can't vote for president. They don't send congressmen, into Washington. So the idea is, to a certain extent, you see some taxation without representation taking place. So what you see is that Puerto Ricans experienced economic and cultural discrimination. During the earliest years of the American control of Puerto Rico, they start to sort of transform Puerto Rico's economy into what we call a single crop export economy. For the most part, they really want the Puerto Ricans to produce sugar and export it to the United States. And so this really prevents the Puerto Rican economy from becoming overly diverse. It makes the Puerto Rican economy increasingly dependent on the U.S. economy. And so this is difficult because what it means is that the Puerto Rican economy is not going to be able to diversify, and it's certainly going to experience some pretty significant downturns, particularly during the Great Depression, where Puerto Ricans experience widespread unemployment. So just like African Americans, you do experience a great migration of Puerto Ricans as well, starting in the 1920s. And so I wanted to just highlight, this is actually a current map of the Puerto Rican population, but this does demonstrate a pretty widespread migration of Puerto Ricans into the United States. Many of them, of course, don't go too far. Many of them end up in Florida. But then the vast majority of the rest of the Puerto Rican population actually lives pretty close to where we do. Some of them were drawn to the manufacturing jobs of World War II. But the problem that we see happening is that the post-World War economic climate shifts dramatically. We have a lot of industries leaving these cities, right? We do experience a significant white flight, which is where the white population starts to move out of areas when the industry leaves, and also when the neighborhood starts to deteriorate. And so what we see is that the industry left these places, but the Puerto Rican population, not unlike the African American population, could not afford to leave. And so people who live in these places oftentimes are experiencing a lot of economic struggles. And then this chart is showing us the influx of Puerto Rican immigrants, which you see is pretty significant during the 1960s, 1950s and 60s. So essentially what we see is that Puerto Ricans are sort of a double minority in the United States. One, because they face a language barrier, and also there are some Puerto Ricans that are not fully white in complexion, and so they also experience a sense of racism when they migrate to the United States. So another major minority that we should consider. We should think about Asian Americans in general, but I really wanted to highlight the Japanese because of the racial prejudice that they experienced during World War II. So one of the things that's important is that Japanese American soldiers make a significant effort to try to fight against that racism that they experienced during the war. Of course, we already are aware of the internment camps that Roosevelt signed off on, but what we see is that many Japanese Americans actually enlist in the military. Now, these soldiers, we see here, they're called Nisei soldiers. So they're oftentimes second-generation Japanese Americans. And their efforts in World War II actually start to help end anti-Japanese discrimination. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. And what this did was it removed the ban on Japanese immigration. So we already know that in the 1940s, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. By passing the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1952, we see that there's an increasing attention to no longer discriminating against the Asian American population. The Immigration and Nationality Act also allowed first-generation Japanese Americans, they were called Issei. It made them eligible for naturalization as well. Also, by 1965, you're going to see that there's going to be some new immigration legislation passed, and this increases opportunities for Asians to immigrate to the United States. And so what we see is from the mid-1960s on, there's going to be a massive change in demographics of the Asian American population, particularly on the west coast of the United States, and then also major urban areas on the east coast. I just wanted to show you, this map is interesting because it shows us immigration patterns, and it's way bigger, obviously, than what we need because we're only really talking about the post-war era. But I just want you to notice that starting in 1960, this blue line represents the Asian American population, and just notice how quickly it rises once these new immigration laws are put into effect in the 1960s. Let's also talk about American Indians. We may remember that in the late 19th century, there were efforts to increasingly put Native Americans in reservations, and also to a certain extent acknowledge their sovereignty. The idea that Native Americans were not really U.S. citizens, their land should not be fully treated like U.S. land, right? But what we start to experience in the 1950s is a deviation away from that. Congress starts to pass a series of termination bills in the 1950s. They passed 12 of them by the end of the 1950s. And what these termination bills do is it ends tribal rights in return for cash payments and division of tribal assets. So in other words, they basically want to be able to exploit resources on Indian reservations. So the goal of the termination laws was actually to take back land that was basically reserved to Native Americans at that point. So Indian activists decided to challenge these government policies. And some of these challenges actually do lead to court decisions, and some of these court decisions reassert the principle of tribal sovereignty. So, in other words, the court is actually going to be fairly favorable towards Native Americans, so that sense of sovereignty is going to continue. The National Congress of American Indians, or the NCAI, challenges termination laws, and it also started to show us a general collaboration of American Indians in ways that are similar. You could think about some of the other major civil rights organizations that are established by people like Asian Americans, by people like African Americans, of course, and also by people like Mexican Americans. They also, in 1969, decide to occupy Alcatraz Island. We can see that down here. And they are forcibly removed by the federal government, but it shows us that they were willing to, just like other civil rights activists, take a more sort of confrontational approach towards their protests. You're going to see that Indians that remain living on reservations oftentimes are trapped in situations of poverty. Some of them turn towards alcoholism. And Indians who leave reservations kind of find themselves losing a lot of their tribal identity. Urban Indian groups oftentimes arose and, to a certain extent, focused more on their civil rights instead of tribal rights. And so in some ways you do see, again, sort of a deviation away from more traditional tribal groups and one towards just embracing the rights of Indians in general. So what we see is that there's currently sort of a difficult struggle between a common Indian identity and independent tribal sovereignty into separate nations. And this sense definitely continues into the modern day. And we do experience, of course, in our area, one of the interesting attachments to tribal sovereignty that still remains is in the creation of Indian casinos in different parts of New England, right? So that sums up the non-Black civil rights movement. I mean, it's important for us to realize that this certainly develops more attention towards the idea that America is beyond just black and white. You're going to see the increasing attention towards non-white issues, even in classrooms. Many colleges during the civil rights era start to establish things like Asian studies programs. Anthropology is going to develop significantly. And so that shows us that even the intellectual community is responding towards these civil rights activists. All right, so thank you so much for watching, and we'll pick up